So it's not a one-size-fits-all. It really depends on the context. In a particular context, some groups that support us, some Jewish groups, for example, in the US, say, oh, we cannot take the whole BDS call. We can do a boycott of Ahava, an Israeli cosmetics company that manufactures in a settlement. We can do that. Code Pink, for example, if some of you have heard of it. So they pick specific campaigns within the BDS realm and they work on it. And that's absolutely fine. So it's not every country does the same kind of boycott, not every city does the same kind of boycott. I always say in London we ask for the moon because the British civil society is fully supportive, at least much more than any other Western country. In Germany, we ask for so little because we understand the difficulty, the history, the Holocaust, the heritage, and so on. In fact, in Israel now, there is a pro-BDS movement. It used to have tens, now it's in the hundreds. After the Gaza massacre, it has hundreds of Israeli intellectuals, academics, and activists who support the Palestinian BDS call. But isn't boycott anti-Semitic? Isn't boycotting Israel anti-Semitic? Well, this accusation is itself anti-Semitic, and let me explain why. It assumes that criticism of Israel, or action against its oppression, by necessity is an attack against all Jews, as if all Jews have this monolithic view in support of Israel and are collectively responsible, and this is the key point. All Jews, according to this, are collectively responsible for the actions and policies of the State of Israel. That is not only false, it's the very definition of anti-Semitism. Assuming that all Jews have a monolithic view and a collective responsibility is the very definition of anti-Semitism. Our movement is anchored in universalist, progressive principles that reject all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-black racism, and so on. We call for a boycott of Israel, not because most Israelis are Jewish, but because Israel is a colonial and apartheid state that's oppressing us. We couldn't care less if it were Catholic, Muslim, Hindu, whatever. So long as it's oppressing us, we shall continue to resist it. Because we want our rights. We want equality. The primary issue we're calling for is equality. To be treated as equal humans, like all humans. No exception. Some BDS achievements, because people say, okay, it sounds nice, but can it work? I mean, Israel is so powerful, what can you do with BDS? Well, it's been working quite well. People do not remember sometimes that the South African call for boycott started in the 1950s. The world, at least the part that counts, the Western world, started heeding the South African calls for boycott in the late 70s, early 80s. It took them 25 years on average to get the word across. In comparison, our South African comrades were doing much better. We're going much, much faster. We started in 2005. By now, we have major trade unions, women's groups, even Jewish groups, and so on supporting us across the world. I'll give a few examples. Just most recently, the government of Norway, and this was a really big precedent, decided to divest from an Israeli military company, Elbit, because it's supplying equipment to the illegal wall in the occupied territories, violating the ICJ ruling that I spoke about. Also very recently, the Toronto International Film Festival faced a huge protest because it had a tribute to Tel Aviv. So many artists and intellectuals across the world came together and signed a petition that says, you cannot celebrate Tel Aviv, especially now, months after what Israel, the war crimes Israel committed in Gaza. Celebrating Tel Aviv is an act of complicity. And who signed this statement? Not your typical, fringe, ultra-left Jane Fonda, Danny Glover, some very top celebrities, artists, Ken Loach, and so on and so forth. Noam Chomsky, of course, and so on. So you had hundreds of very important figures signing that petition, saying we do not want to see Tel Aviv celebrated at the Toronto International Film Festival. They went even further in that same petition. They said Israel has established an apartheid regime against the Palestinians. And to have the A word in a petition signed by so many celebrities was a coup, was a true coup. Other than those two very recent examples, in Canada, just across the border, we have major Canadian trade unions. I can't list them now, there's not much time, but they're major Canadian unions, including the Canadian Union of Public Employees in Ontario, and many others in Quebec, teachers' unions, students' unions, and so on. Independent Jewish Voices, which is one of the most important independent Jewish groups in Canada, adopted BDS fully. The United Church of Canada debated the issue very fiercely and finally decided to adopt a form of very flexible, very selective boycott of certain settlement products and so on. But they adopted the logic. They allowed the debate of the boycott of Israel, which is extremely important. In Durban, South Africa, in February, COSATU, the largest trade union federation, took a very important action. They refused to offload an Israeli ship in protest over the Israeli massacre of Palestinians in Gaza. And that was the first time this happened. An Australian dock workers union supported that action. Other than COSATU, the Irish Trade Union Federation, the Scottish Trade Union Federations have supported BDS. Even in France, and France was one of the more difficult countries, we had a major public workers union, including most of the public teachers, with 163,000 members supporting BDS. Here in the US, Hampshire College set a historic precedent, divesting from 6 companies profiting from the occupation. Also in the US, American Jews for Just Peace has adopted BDS. Jewish Voice for Peace has not adopted BDS yet, but they're joining, as I said earlier, a boycott campaign against an Israeli company. So they accept. And I have to wrap up. I'll give a very important indicator of the success of the BDS movement so far. APAC, the largest Israel lobby in the US. APAC Executive Director Howard Kaur referred to the BDS campaign just this last May, saying, quote, "No longer is this campaign confined to the ravings of the political far left or far right, but increasingly it's entering the American mainstream. An ordinary political discourse on our TV and radio talk shows, in the pages of our major newspapers, and in countless blogs, in town hall meetings, on campuses and city squares. These voices are laying the predicate for abandonment." So just to wrap up, the global BDS movement for Palestinian rights is our best hope of non-violently resisting Israel's occupation and oppression. Very important to underline, it's a non-violent form of resistance. It presents a progressive, anti-racist, sustainable form of civil resistance, and it has a real chance of achieving a just peace in our region. I really think our South Africa moment has arrived. Thank you.